Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Tech Talk podcast. I am your host, Saumitra Kalikar. Now, late last year, I did a podcast where I talked about four strategic technology imperatives for Australian businesses in heading into 2026. One of those strategic imperatives is establishing digital sovereignty. Now, in this episode, I aim to unpack what does digital sovereignty means practically, what are the misconceptions around it, which mandates are explicit, which mandates are implicit but potentially unavoidable, and how Australian enterprises should respond architecturally and strategically to achieve digital sovereignty. So let's dive in. So as we head into 2026, the global digital environment is becoming far more fragmented and contested than it was even a few years back. The geopolitical tension, the export controls, and long running cyber espionage have all increased the risk profile of digital supply chains. So, for Australian organizations, this means that digital sovereignty is no longer just a compliance objective. It is increasingly a question of resilience. And this is especially true for organizations which are in regulated sectors, which are part of government supply chains, which manage critical national infrastructure, or simply those who manage high value data and intellectual property. Now, it is also important to be very clear about the Australian context. Within Australia, there isn't a single overarching digital sovereignty mandate. Instead, sovereignty expectations are enforced through a layered mix of the legal, sector specific regulations, um, then government security frameworks, and procurement requirements. And together, those forces are quietly but materially shaping enterprise architecture decisions across both public and private sector. So, to really understand digital sovereignty, we need to clear up one common misconception straight away. In Australian enterprise conversations, sovereignty is often reduced to data residency. That is where the data sits. But that's an oversimplification. Sovereignty is best understood as the ability to maintain legal, operational, and technical control over your digital assets, and especially when the conditions change or external pressure is applied. So, when you look at it that way, sovereignty breaks down into three distinct but interconnected layers. The first is data sovereignty or the legal control. This is about which legal jurisdiction governs your data and how enforceable that jurisdiction really is in practice. In Australian context, this intersects most clearly with the Privacy Act and the accountability requirements around cross-border data handling. Now, Australia doesn't have a mandate for universal data localization. What it does require, though, is that the organizations actively manage legal exposure when data is stored or processed overseas. Sovereignty risk emerges when foreign legal regimes can compel access to data in ways that can conflict with Australian legal or ethical obligations. The second layer is operational sovereignty or control of access. This is less about law and more about operational reality. So consider the questions around who can administer your systems, where are your support systems located, who has authority during an incident, and so on and so forth. Now, in Australia, the strict operational sovereignty requirements exist mainly within government and regulated sectors. But those expectations don't stay contained. They increasingly flow into private sector through procurement requirements, assurance reviews, and third-party risk management. And the third layer is software and technical sovereignty, which is really about supply chain resilience. This is your ability to audit, maintain, or replace critical digital components without being trapped by uncontrollable vendors. That does not mean everything has to be built locally or has to be open source. It means making architecture choices that reduce lock-in, improve portability, and allow independent security assurance, especially for systems that support critical operations and valuable intellectual property. So when you put these three layers together, sovereignty stops being a slogan. It becomes a very practical question of control across your entire digital estate. So one of the biggest misconceptions in this space is confusing data residency with digital sovereignty. Now, data residency is simply about where data is stored. That is the physical location of the servers. And while that can help, on its own, it doesn't give you the sovereignty. What really matters is everything around it. For example, which laws apply, who can access the systems, who controls the encryption keys, and whether contracts actually give you the enforceable control. So you can host data in Australia, but still be exposed to foreign legal or operational influence if those pieces aren't designed deliberately. And that's why for Australian enterprises, sovereignty isn't just a hosting choice. It's a governance and architecture problem where the data sets is just one part of the overall picture. Now, let's quickly understand the global and regional context here as well. Over the last couple of years, one thing has become explicitly very clear that the digital supply chains are no longer insulated from geopolitics. Now, technology is now part of state level competition. We are seeing export controls on advanced semiconductors, restrictions on critical minerals, and most importantly, a steady rise in long running cyber espionage. Even though Australia sits firmly within trusted allied frameworks, reliance on global technology supply chains now comes with more uncertainty than it did, let's say, 5 years back. So, access control, support, and availability can no longer be taken for granted. For most enterprises, this isn't direct or immediate threat, but it's a real one. The assumption that digital capability will always be available, uninterrupted, and fully under your control is no longer a safe assumption. And that's why resilience and sovereignty are starting to show up in mainstream enterprise decisions, not just government policies. So it's useful to understand how digital sovereignty actually shows up across Australian economy because it is not uniform. There are really three layers to it. If you're traveling from bottom to top, the first is the whole of economy baseline. Most Australian organizations are touched by the Privacy Act and the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme. These don't mandate sovereignty in the strict sense, that is, they don't tell you where data must live, but they do impose accountability. You are responsible for personal information regardless of whether it is processed onshore or offshore. That means you need visibility, contractual controls, and the ability to respond to breaches wherever your data sits. The second layer is where sovereignty becomes explicit and enforceable, and that is in specific sectors. Critical infrastructure is the clearest example. Under the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, many privately owned organizations now carry national level obligations. So, so let's take few examples just to clarify these points. So for a private hospital, this is no longer theoretical. If the government asks who can access patient systems during a crisis, we do not know is no longer an acceptable answer. Similarly, in energy sector, the shift is just as stark. Once energy data is treated as a critical infrastructure, the conversation moves from is this cloud cheaper to can Australia keep the lights on if access or supply chains are disrupted. Financial services is another sector where sovereignty is effectively mandatory. APRA regulated organizations are required to manage information security and operational risks across all third parties. And in practice, that obligation cascades. Technology vendors, SaaS providers, and service partners inherit sovereignty style expectations through contracts, audits, and assurance reviews. The third layer applies specifically to government. within Australia. The Australian government agencies must comply with formal security and cloud frameworks like PSPF, ISM, and the hosting certification framework. These are mandatory for government, not for although it is not for broader economy. But their influence does extend well beyond government. By shaping procurement rules and defining what acceptable risk looks like, these frameworks effectively set the bar that many enterprises end up designing to, especially if they want to sell their services into government and regulated sectors. So, when people ask whether digital sovereignty is required in Australia, the honest answer is it depends where you operate. But the direction of travel is very clear. The closer you are to critical services, regulated industries, or government supply chains, the less optional sovereignty becomes. Now, there is another dimension of digital sovereignty which is unique within Australia, and that is indigenous data sovereignty. Now, at its core, it is about recognizing the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples to have control over their data about their community, their lands, culture, and lived experiences. Indigenous data sovereignty isn't yet a single universal legal requirement within Australia, but in practice, it is becoming embedded through research governance, funding conditions, the reconciliation commitments, and sector specific expectations. For organizations in areas like healthcare, education, research, financial services, and any public facing digital platforms, this is no longer theoretical. Ignoring indigenous data governance now carries real risk that could be reputational, ethical, or even operational. In other words, even though the law is still evolving, the enterprises that want to operate responsibly within Australia need to design their data governance with this reality in mind. So, how should organizations architect their systems to support digital sovereignty? When organizations actually do this well, a few consistent design patterns emerge. First, they segment workloads deliberately. Public facing services, internal business systems, and the most sensitive assets, like things like core intellectual property or critical infrastructure, they don't all live in the same environment. By design, the highest risk data runs in the most controlled environments. Second, they retain control of encryption keys. Sovereignty in many ways comes down to who hold the keys. When Australian entities control encryption, access is governed by Australian law. Zero trust principles can be enforced properly, and dependence on vendors is materially reduced. Third, when public cloud is needed, they use confidential computing. This allows data to stay encrypted even when it is being processed, which means cloud providers can't see or access sensitive workloads. It's a way of combining hyperscale capability with sovereign control. Fourth, they design for portability, not permanence. Hybrid and multi cloud architectures, which are built on open standards, help workloads to move quickly if cost, risk, or geopolitics change. This optionality is a form of sovereignty by itself. And finally, they treat exit as a design requirement, not an afterthought. Sovereign architectures assume that suppliers may fail, they might change terms, they might become unavailable. So, exit clauses, regular risk assessments, and tested exit plans are built in from day one and not discovered during a crisis. So, the key takeaway is this: the organizations getting this right aren't choosing between innovation or sovereignty. They are architecting in a way that lets them do both safely. Let's also understand the market dynamics and economic reality and how that relates to digital sovereignty. If you look at the market data, the shift towards sovereignty is clearly showing up where money is being spent. Gartner has already forecasted that Australian IT spending will reach around 172 billion in Australian dollars in 2026, close to 9% increase year on year. What's interesting is why that money is being invested. Organizations aren't pointing first to regulations, they are calling out operational risks, volatility, supply chain uncertainty, and a broader shift away from cloud first towards what many now are calling cloud smart. For example, around 62% of Australian executives, now rank cyber risk as one of their top three priorities. Nearly half of industrial organizations experienced supply chain disruptions in 2025, and about 44% manufacturers are actively increasing investment in their supply chains, not for optimization but for resilience. At the same time, many organizations are dealing with what's often described as cyber shock. Costs have become unpredictable, workloads are hard to move, and vendor locking is more visible than it was a few years ago. Industry estimates suggest up to 30% of cloud spend is effectively wasted, particularly for stable long running workloads. So, as a result, we are seeing organizations repatriate those predictable workloads and systems into private or sovereign cloud environments. Not necessarily because they are cheaper, but because they are more controllable. Flat rate pricing in Australian dollars reduces currency exposure and makes long term planning easier. So, the big picture is that the investment in sovereign capabilities isn't being driven by regulations alone. It is being driven by boards and executives to reduce risk, volatility, and uncertainty, and realizing that sovereignty, cost, predictability, and resilience are all starting to point in the same direction. So, here is a practical roadmap for CIOs and enterprise leaders to improve their digital sovereignty. A credible digital sovereignty strategy tends to follow a very practical progression. Most organizations which do this well typically move through three stages. The first stage is getting visibility. This is about understanding where your data lives, who controls it, and what your real dependencies are across the digital estate. Because if you can't clearly explain who can access your systems, from where they can access, and which under which legal authority they can access the data and the systems, you don't have sovereignty yet. The second stage is segmentation. Not every workload needs the same level of sovereignty. The key is aligning architecture choices with data sensitivity, regulatory exposure, and business criticality. Your most critical systems need to be deliberately isolated and designed for control, not just for convenience. The low risk workloads, on the other hand, can remain more flexible. The third stage is governance. Sovereignty only scales when it is embedded into procurement, risk management, and overall operating models. If it relies on, let's say, individual architects, informal decisions, and one of exceptions, it won't survive the pressure. So, contracts, policies, and decision rights, these all have to do the very heavy lifting. And the final point is this: sovereignty isn't a one time compliance exercise, it's an ongoing discipline. It needs to evolve with enterprise risk, resiliency requirements, and the long term strategic freedom, especially in today's environment where technology, regulation, and geopolitics continue to change rapidly. So, to conclude, let's keep in mind that digital sovereignty in Australia isn't driven by a single law, and it is not required in the same way for every organization. But when you put regulations, government policies, geopolitical tension, and supply chain dependencies together, one thing becomes clear. For many enterprises, sovereignty considerations are no longer optional or theoretical, they are unavoidable. The organizations that will navigate this best are the ones that treat sovereignty as a strategic capability and grounded in the legal reality, architecture discipline, and operational control. In an increasingly fragmented digital world, this capability is becoming a core part of enterprise resilience and long term competitiveness. And with that, thanks for spending your time with us on Enterprise Tech Talk. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Hope you liked today's episode. Please subscribe us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X platforms. Also, if you are passionate about any such enterprise technology topics and want to participate in the discussion, please reach out at inquiry@enterprisetechtalk.com. Also, please visit the website www.enterprisetechtalk.com for more details.